Right, everyone. How are you guys doing today? Good. Well, thank you for coming to our Maritime Heritage Series lecture. My name is Courtney Felton. I'm an Associate Curator of Education, and I'm really excited to talk to you about one of my absolute favorite marsh animals, which is the Diamondback Terrapin. So today we're going to talk a little bit about their past, and then we're also going to talk about how they're doing now, as well as their future and what conservation efforts we are seeing with our terrapins. Now, these Maritime Heritage Lectures occur on Thursdays throughout the year. Our next one is going to be on October 17th, and it's the story behind Echo the Whale and his skeleton, which will be presented by Keith Rittmaster, our natural science curator. So always a great presentation. Definitely come on back. So let's talk about this amazing animal. So I have a really short video that will hopefully play today of my little Diamondback Terrapin hatchling. He's very cute. You're going to see him. He's going to blink in a second. Oh, so cute. Just a great way to get started with our presentation. So let's start with what's in a name. Let's start with our Diamondback Terrapin. The scientific name for this animal is Malaclemys terrapin. Now, there's a lot of thoughts about what this name could mean. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, everyone. Didn't expect my phone to ring. Weird. So the main thought is that this came from an Algonquin native word called terope, which means edible turtle. However, if you took Latin, you may have seen the mal in the genus this name, and you might think bad or evil. There is a thought, especially by some Gulf fishermen, that this was a bad turtle. They called it a wind turtle. If you were to accidentally get them in your nets, they thought that it would lead to changes in the storm cycle and you would have bad luck befall you. Now, if you look at it from a Greek standpoint, the word malakos in Greek means soft, and clemys means turtle. So they might be a soft turtle, referring to their head and their body, or it could be in reference to their soft-bodied prey that they like to eat, like snails. The general thought, though, is that it does come from a native word meaning edible turtle. So these animals are found all throughout the East Coast and Gulf of Mexico. They range from Cape Cod down into the Gulf, and they live in estuarine habitats. They love a salt marsh. That mixture of salt water and fresh water, that brackish water we see, is their bread and butter. They are specially designed to live in that habitat, and they are the only turtle that we know of that will live in those brackish waters. Along their route, we do see 7 subspecies with some hybrids forming as well. In North Carolina, we actually have 2 of the subspecies. We have the northern Diamondback terrapin, as well as the Carolina Diamondback terrapin. Now, it is nearly impossible to tell these animals apart. There is so much diversity in shell patternation, skin patternation. The only way to really tell the subspecies apart is through genetic studies. Now, if you think about Atlantic versus Gulf, there is a little bit more difference there. The Gulf turtles tend to have a little bit bigger of a head. They also tend to have more of a ridge along their shell. But overarchingly, they're pretty similar. Now, I said they live in our salt marshes. That's a pretty intense habitat to live in. So they do have some special adaptations that help them to survive. So a big one is going to be their carapace or their shell. So Diamondback terrapins get their name because of the concentric rings along that shell. And you can actually use those rings to age a terrapin if they're small. It doesn't work after they're about 3 to 4 years old, but when they're young, you can use those rings to help age them. You can use the rings as well as the pattern of spots on their skin to identify individuals. We see a lot of variation throughout my photos. You're going to see it as well. We see some individuals with big spots. We see some with small spots. We see some that look like they have a little mustache. There's a lot of variation with these animals. Now, that shell is really important for protection in their environment, and they are built into their shell. They cannot escape. Their spine runs right down the center, and then their ribs make up the rest of that shell. If we move to their head, I said that these animals live in brackish water. They don't love to drink salt water. So they do have a salt gland similar to a sea turtle. It's going to act like a kidney to help remove that salt from the water and extrude the salt from that spot right behind their eyes. So it almost looks like tears coming out. This is really helpful for these animals. They will go into true ocean water occasionally, but they always tend to come back to our marsh. Now, staying on their head, if you look at them, we don't see any evidence of ears, but they can hear. They have a tympanic membrane that sits below the surface, acts kind of like a drum to sense vibrations in the water, and that's what they're going to use to hear. And then the last feature along their head is going to be their beak. So if we zoom into their beak, boop, they have this big, hard beak made out of keratin, so the same thing as our nails or our hair. And they have bony plates inside their mouth. And they're going to use those to eat crunchy things. Now, similar to our hair and our fingernails, it does continuously grow. So they need to eat those crunchy things to actually help wear down their beak as they're growing. So I have a picture here of one of their favorite food items. It's very small. It is the marsh periwinkle snail. Those are going to be those little white snails that you sometimes see on salt marsh grasses going up and down. They love to eat them. And their mouth is designed to get pretty big and go around it. This video I'm going to play is of a juvenile Diamondback Terrapin, and he was very insistent that the container he was in was his food item, but you'll be able to see his mouth opening pretty wide as he works to get his food. So you can just see that big mouth trying really hard, great at eating those crunchy things. They're also going to eat crabs, they'll eat worms, they'll eat fish. Sometimes we found grass in their diet, but we really don't think they're purposely eating grass. That's mostly just a byproduct of what they are eating. Now, if we look at their feet, if you've ever held a Diamondback Terrapin, they are feisty, I think is the best way to put it. They move those limbs a lot. They're kicking and almost looking like they're swimming as they're moving through. They have really powerful legs. They have really big feet with nice long claws that are very helpful in moving through a muddy environment and climbing up onto rocks to bask. So I do have a video showing a terrapin swimming. This is going to be a bigger female swimming by. You can see those big webbed feet for swimming, and then also her nails that she's using as she's moving. All right. And now that we have their adaptations, we'll talk a little bit about their life cycle. This is an animal that is sexually dimorphic. Our females are going to be significantly larger than our males. The females end up being about 6 to 9 inches in shell length, and they can weigh about 1.5 pounds. Our males, on the other hand, end up being 4 inches, maybe 5 inches, and about 0.5 pound. So a pretty big difference in size between them. The females have a much broader head, and then they're also a little bit chunkier. Is maybe not the nicest way to put it, but they're a little bit thicker. And this is really important for laying eggs. So these animals mate in the spring, and then the female terrapins will move away from the marsh, generally towards a sandier, dirty area that is not going to get inundated with water. And they're going to lay their nests from late April to early July. The nests are about 6 to 8 inches below the sediment level, and they lay anywhere from 4 to 18 eggs. And depending on where you are, they can lay multiple nests during a season. So these eggs are going to stay in the nest for anywhere from 9 to 12 to maybe 15-ish weeks, depending on where you are along the coast. If it's warmer, it's a shorter incubation time than if it's colder. But after that time, they are going to hatch, and they're about the size of a quarter. So relatively small, Now, interestingly, if the nest is laid late in the season and the eggs hatch late in the season, sometimes those hatchlings will actually just overwinter in the nest. So they'll stay in the nest, and then we'll see a spring emergence when the conditions are better for the animal. From there, they're just going to grow. They're going to start eating all of that food that they like to eat. And after about 5 to 7 years, they will reach mature size and they'll be able to reproduce. With these animals, the males are between 3 to 3.5 inches in shell length when they're mature, and the females are going to be about 5.5 inches to reach mature size. And then it just continues. So now that we have some information about this animal, let's talk about their past. First and foremost, this animal has always been known as an edible turtle. So going way back, we have evidence of native tribes from Maryland down through Georgia consuming terrapins. And we get this evidence from shell middens or the shell refuse piles that we see. If you think about Shell Point on Harker's Island, that's a good example of one of those. Looking in there, we see lots of evidence of oysters, we see clams, but they have also found turtle shells and turtle bones. Additionally, Thomas Harriot talks of the abundance and usefulness of turtles and terrapins in his writing A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia. Specifically, he says, there are many tortoises, both of land and sea kind. Their backs and bellies are shelled very thick. Their head, feet, and tail, which are in appearance, seem ugly, though they are members of a serpent or venomous. Notwithstanding, they are very good meat, as also their eggs. So, was eating these animals. Our early colonists were eating these animals. And then if we move further on in time, we get into the late 1800s and early 1900s, and we see article after article in our local newspapers talking about what a good animal this was to eat. What I find interesting about this article is it's titled A Savory Reptile, and then the entire article just talks about the behavior and habits, doesn't mention food consumption again, but a savory reptile. And this is very, very true of their history. We have lots of examples of how they were prepared. This article talks about the delight of the epicure and how these chefs loved to prepare them. They were sad when the season was over. They were the best as long as you removed the gallbladder. Had to remove the gallbladder, otherwise it was no good. We also see it on menus. So we have the bill of fare for President Lincoln's second inauguration. And up at the very top, it says that terrapin was served as an appetizer. Additionally, we have a dinner menu from New York City from 1900 that talks about terrapin Maryland style. And for your reference, if you have never consumed terrapin soup Maryland style, the terrapin is first thrown alive into tepid water. The skin and claws are removed. A second immersion in the water follows. The undershell is then cut away and the gallbladder and liver are removed. After this operation, the terrapin is stewed until thoroughly cooked. The stew is then garnished with eggs, cream, butter, and spices. And when ready for the table, a little wine is added. Often sherry was the choice, but other wine as well. And then along with Maryland style, we also see Philadelphia style being very popular at this time. Philadelphia style included the addition of terrapin eggs in the end soup. This was a pretty high class item. You would go to a fancy restaurant to get it, which is a bit of a change from our Native Americans eating it, but we do see that shift. And then as we continue forward in time, it becomes everywhere. So turtle soup, we have Heinz and Campbell creating ready-made turtle soup. This is generally sea turtle, but it was also snapping turtle and terrapin. If you have a Joy of Cooking edition between 1931 and 1975, you will have a recipe for terrapin soup. It's pretty similar to the recipe I just read out, but keep an eye out in there. And then we also see it in the White House. So I mentioned Lincoln, but moving forward in time, Grover Cleveland included a dish of terrapin soup in his first ever White House cookbook in 1897. Taft, who we all know really liked his food, kept a specialist chef on White House payroll who knew how to prepare a dish known as the Taft terrapin soup, a little bit different. This soup was made with 1 turtle and 4 pounds of veal and was always served with champagne. That was how he preferred to have his terrapin soup. And then finally, we have FDR, who served terrapin with cornbread sticks at a state dinner with King George VI in 1939 when he visited the White House. So we are seeing this animal being very, very popular. And so what does that mean? Well, there was a lot of money to be made in the terrapin fishery. And we see records of terrapins being so abundant to the annoyance of some of our fishermen. One of the accounts talks about the terrapins were once an occasion of much annoyance in the Stumpy Point Bay region. That's going to be in Dare County. It being sometimes necessary to lose a haul of fish because the quantity of terrapins unavoidably taken when hauling a net near the marshes prevented the drawing of the net. The image that I have from the North Carolina Geological Society bulletin shows them harvesting terrapin eggs. And then I have this image of a pound or a terrapin pen in Hatteras, and you can see all of those little dots are all terrapins. And so they would collect them, they might hold them until they were able to sell them. They were selling for quite a bit at the height of our terrapin fishery, potentially going for $90 a dozen for our adult females. What about if we look at Carteret County? Well, we have a record from Richard Coker, who was employed by the U.S. Fisheries Bureau, and he says, so rare and so well concealed are the terrapins that sometimes an expert fisherman may search every day for a week without finding one. Again, only one is found on a trip, while another day, half a dozen or even a dozen or more may be obtained. They are not abundant enough in the region of Beaufort to make it profitable to an ordinary fisherman to hunt them. So a little bit different than Dare County, where you have to throw out your fish. But we get to images like this in the late 1930s, early 1940s of terrapin races. In all of those little kiddos' hands, there's a terrapin. And then in my bottom image, you can see terrapins with a flag on them racing as much as a terrapin races from point A to point B. So what happened to go from them being not abundant in the region to enough to have these races? Well, the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries came in. So in 1902, the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, which eventually becomes NOAA Fisheries after a number of changes throughout the years, moved on to Pivers Island. And starting at that very beginning in 1902, they were interested in terrapins. And so they started these experimental ponds. These ponds were made out of wood. They took advantage of the natural geography of the area. So they were set to go out into the water so the tidal influence would be occurring in these pens. They had 2 layers of wood. Additionally, they had wood going around horizontally to prevent the terrapins from climbing out, because I mentioned those nails. If you put a terrapin in a corner with those nails, they can climb shockingly well. So having that additional edge helped to protect their terrapins from escaping. It also gave a walkway for people to observe the terrapins and feed the terrapins. Now, unfortunately, for these initial setups, they did not last. So in 1903, the experiments actually moved to Maryland. So they went to the U.S. Fisheries Bureau in Maryland and stayed there until 1908. At that point, it was deemed too expensive to continue the operation in Maryland. So they moved it back to Beaufort. And we built new pens that were a little bit sturdier and could last a little bit longer. So here are these newer enclosures. My picture on the left is going to show a schematic of what these pens looked like. My picture on the right was taken later in the history of our terrapin rearing on Pivers Island because it's made out of concrete, but similar idea. In these pens, they're going to have a laying bed up on the top that's sandy. It always stays dry. That is where our female terrapins will go up to lay their nests. And then you have this intermittent area where you have that tidal influence. And then you have a space that's always going to be underwater. Now, on the side of this, which is hard to see, but on the side, there are actually pens for the young. They separated the young from the adult terrapins. And it's not because adult terrapins intentionally do anything to hurt baby terrapins or young terrapins. But if you think about an animal that's a quarter size and an animal that's 7 inches in size, it's quite easy for those little ones to maybe get stepped on. So having that separate space was really helpful in rearing these animals. And they were very focused on experiments. So they were trying to discover what is the best way to rear these animals, what are the ratios we want to have, and maybe what will happen if we have them indoors in the winter instead of having them outdoors. So they did a lot of different experimentation. Here are a couple more photos of the U.S. Fisheries Bureau building with some circle ponds in the back that were used as fish hatcheries, which was important for feeding the terrapins. That was one of the reasons they were pretty expensive to keep, is you had to feed them a lot of fish. So having those fish hatcheries was really helpful. And then a laying pen again, you can see the terrapins laying their nests in there. Now, on top of our federal effort, we also see private companies in the area rearing Diamondback terrapins. So a really good example of this for Beaufort is the Diamondback Terrapin Company, which was created in 1913 by Dr. Charles L. Duncan of Duncan House fame, as well as Charles Hatzel, who was employed by the U.S. Fisheries Bureau as a captain, but was also managing and a big influence on the terrapin research that was happening at the Fisheries Bureau. And then F.E. Williams, who is based out of Washington, D.C. So they took the knowledge that the Fisheries Bureau had and was sharing and used it to create a farm that was raising terrapins to go directly to market. That was their goal, was to make money off of these little terrapins. And they started out with 3,000 terrapins, about 1,100 of which were matured, meaning that they could reproduce. And after that first season, they had over 700 young that they needed to take care of. So pretty successful on that very first year. And we just kind of see them continuing to be successful until about the 1920s. The goal for them as of August of 1915 was to put no less than 10,000 Diamondback terrapins on market per year. At that time, the selling was $20 to $60 a dozen. So 10,000 terrapins, $20 to $60 a dozen. You can make a good chunk of money that way. My second image on the right shows our newly hatched terrapins being kept warm and fed through the cold season at the Beaufort or Diamondback Terrapin Company. They had 25,000 newly hatched terrapins being warmed over winter. And what they found is that by doing this, by removing their natural habit to go into brumation, which is sort of like a hibernation during the winter, they would grow to the size of 2 to 3-year-old terrapins in 9 months. So pretty successful, but 25,000 terrapins is a lot of terrapins. It's kind of crazy to me. So what did this all mean? Well, we see this kind of cyclical nature here. So this is going to show the increasing price of Diamondback terrapins until the 1920s. And then we see a decline, and we see that go back up again, and then we see a decline again right around the Great Depression. At the same time, if you look at wild catches of Diamondback terrapins, landings are very, very low. Now, this data is specifically from an article that was looking mainly at Maryland, but the pattern we see is the same in North Carolina. So what happened? Well, World War I. So World War I was really helpful in helping to increase our numbers again, and that's partially because those fisheries lost their workmen. They went to war. And so cost of labor went way up. And so we see less terrapins being landed during that time. Additionally, prohibition is thought to have helped our Diamondback terrapin populations. If you remember that Maryland style and Philadelphia style and Taft liked having champagne or sherry with these animals, we do see that. This article is by a gentleman who ate some of Dr. Duncan's Diamondback Terrapins before Prohibition, had an amazing experience, was so excited to see Dr. Duncan selling Diamondback Terrapins again. He got some, he took them to a chef to prepare them Baltimore style, and then said, but when we got the terrapin cooked, it turned out not to be Diamondback Terrapin at all. Not the Diamondback Terrapin of anti-prohibition days. The sherry wine was missing. And I discovered for the first time that Diamondback Terrapin's sans sherry might as well be any old terrapin or no terrapin at all. I swallowed my disappointment, or a liberal portion of it. So just not quite the same. And then to follow this up, we know that Prohibition didn't last for forever. This article came from 1933, and it's saying, hey, now that alcohol's back, maybe Carteret County can stand to make some money off the terrapin farming again and terrapin catching. And the last line of this is really my favorite, and that's the reason I included it, which says, surely the pretzel will not crowd Sir Terrapin from the stage of this new American drama. I will say that I am okay that the pretzel won out over the terrapin if I'm having a beer. And then we have our federal attention. So I mentioned that start of the U.S. Fisheries Bureau. We can talk a little bit more about them. So they started in 1909 with an initial broodstock of 67. That's 23 males and 44 females. Way smaller than my Diamondback Terrapin company's 1,100 nesting that they had. They did a lot to advance terrapin research. Some of the experiments they ran related to space requirements for young and adults, the size of egg beds required, natural sex ratio required for breeding purposes, practicability for increasing growth, hastening maturity, and reducing the death rate by feeding young terrapins during the winter, the control of disease among terrapins, as well as some selective breeding experiments to see if you have a big male and a big female, do you get bigger offspring? And then also some crossbreeding. They tried to cross the Carolina terrapin with the Texas terrapin to see if those would be a better option, hardier, maybe better for market. Overarchingly, this was very successful. So this chart is showing the average number of terrapins hatched per year by the Fisheries Bureau. So from 1911 to 1915, they averaged about 1,400 terrapins a year. If you continue along to the very end, when we get to 1937 to 1941, that number was almost 14,000. That is hugely successful. And we do see some changes after 1925. They built some additional pens for the terrapins. We also see some variation with them, moving them all to hot houses versus not hot houses. They messed around with things quite a bit, just trying to figure out what was the best practice. And it depended on what PhD was in charge of the project at the time. The program ran for 39 years until Charles Hatzel retired from the lab. In this image, he is releasing 15,000 baby Diamondback Terrapins in Eastern Carolina waters. At the end of their time, they released 249,000 Diamondback Terrapins. That is a huge number. And they released them not just in North Carolina, they released them in South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Florida, and California. I don't know about that California population. They are not native to California. Interesting experiment. They also had individuals from other countries come in and learn about how they were rearing these turtles to take that back and use that information. And kind of a fun fact for me is that some of the females from that 1909 initial brood were still reproducing in 1949. So that suggests that they can reproduce for a very long time. And they advanced terrapin policy. So I'm going to talk about that on this next slide where we talk about our laws. So we do see state laws starting all the way back in the 1850s. In the 1850s, the General Assembly of North Carolina banned the use of drag nets by non-residents for catching terrapins. The reason for this is that in the Chesapeake Bay, those Maryland terrapins, they said that they were better than our Carolina terrapins. They were worth more money. And so these Maryland and Virginia fishermen were coming down to North Carolina, catching terrapins, taking them back, and then selling them as Chesapeake Bay terrapins. And North Carolina said, no, no, we want the money. Please give us the money. So they banned non-residents from catching them. And then in 1881, they prohibited the take of these terrapins from April 15th to August 15th. That's going to be their nesting season. And they were prohibited of taking any less than 5 inches in size at any point throughout the year. So the goal was to get those juveniles up to that size where they can start reproducing. And then in the 1920s and 30s, the US Fisheries Bureau starts to come into this conversation, and they closed the fishery for 5 years from 1925 to 1930 with the goal of establishing a hatchery restock program. And then after 1930, they increased the severity of the no-take rule from April 15th to July 31st for this rule, but still continued. So now we can talk about terrapins today. So the current status of Diamondback terrapins, they are listed as vulnerable by the IUCN Red List. I just found out today that there is a push to put them on the endangered species list. NOAA is starting a year-long campaign, is not quite the right word, but comment period for adding Diamondback terrapins as endangered. In North Carolina, they are listed as a species of special concern. And what this means is that they cannot be collected or taken except under a special permit issued by the Wildlife Commission's executive director. And then additionally, in North Carolina, we do have 2 Diamondback terrapin management areas. These are in Masonboro Sound and the lower Cape Fear River. And that is down by Wilmington. But in those areas, there are special requirements for protecting the Diamondback terrapin. So what are their current threats? We know that we are not consuming them anymore. So what is happening to them now to have them be listed as vulnerable? Well, a big issue is habitat loss. Our salt marshes are a phenomenal habitat. We love to have them. They are a really important nursery. We like to use them as well. But unfortunately, we are seeing some degradation of our salt marshes due to waves, due to sea level rise, due to man-made structures that are designed to help stabilize our shore, but in the process, eat out the middle of that space. We also, unfortunately, see a lot of bycatch in the crab pot fishery for these animals. They like to eat those same smelly fish that we like to put in a crab pot. They are very happy to eat them. Unfortunately, as an air-breathing reptile, they cannot stay underwater for a day. So what we'll see is this, especially in derelict or ghost crab pots, ones that are no longer actively being fished, those Diamondback terrapins will get stuck in there. The estimate is that 60 to 80,000 terrapins are caught in crab pots each year. We also see road mortality. Now, this is mostly of the females, as the females are crossing from the marsh to the area where they're going to lay their nest. This happens during our breeding season, and it's more common in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina than it is North Carolina, but it can still happen here. Predators, especially of the nests, foxes, raccoons, some birds, some crabs will very happily eat those juvenile eggs or those baby terrapins. So we want to keep an eye on that. And then finally, pollution. I think that's my microphone. Anyway, finally, pollution. In our waterways, these animals have that soft skin. And so while it's not like a frog and they can breathe through their skin, that skin is really sensitive. And so if we have oil or gas pollution in our waterways or chemicals of other nature that can be in the food that they consume, it can affect their livelihood as well. So now that I got everyone really sad, we'll talk about conservation. We're going to end on a positive note. I said we're celebrating their future. We're going to end on a positive note, I promise. So let's talk a little bit about terrapin conservation in North Carolina. A big thing that we have in North Carolina is the terrapin tally. So this has been going on for 10 years. It started in 2014 down in the Wilmington area and has since spread. And this is a citizen science effort where you can be trained on how to spot terrapins and how to input the data. You go out and you kayak a specific route and look for diamondback terrapins. It's great. It's a really fun experience. And this data was actually used in creating those diamondback terrapin management areas that I mentioned. So this is useful data that is being incorporated. They have expanded this. So now you can actually, if you were to scan this QR code, it will take you to a survey. And anytime you see a diamondback terrapin, you can enter that information, not just during the terrapin tally. That is mostly during our mating and nesting season. Additionally, we are taking an effort to help with the crab pot issues. So the Division of Marine Fisheries has approved 2 designs to our crab pots that are mandatory within our diamondback terrapin management areas. One of them is a bycatch reduction device. That's going to be that orange square. It goes at the inside of the funnel, and it prevents, especially those big females, from being able to make it into that crab pot. So those females can't make it in. They swim on to live their life elsewhere, get another meal. This is not most fishermen's favorite thing. One, you have to add them after the fact, once you already have the crab pots, and they believe that it inhibits the size of crab that you can catch. Studies on this done by the University of North Carolina, Wilmington has not shown that to be true, but they're always looking for better options and they want to work with the fishermen. So the second option is what they call a narrow funnel device. So instead of the funnel being 14 down to 12 hex size, it's 11 to 9. And that, again, was shown to significantly decrease the number of terrapins that were caught, but not to decrease the number of crabs or the size of blue crabs that were caught. And this is really nice because it's something that can be employed by the individuals building the crab pots, and it's not something that has to be added on after the fact to your crab pot. So these are really big. Other states are actually looking at these designs as well and starting to implement them. New Jersey just got all of the information about it, and they're working with their fishermen to see about implementing it along their coast as well. And then additionally, in North Carolina, we just passed the Salt Marsh Action Plan, which has the goal of protecting and restoring our 220,000 acres of salt marsh that we see in our state. So this plan has a lot of parts to it, but a lot of it is making sure that we have happy, healthy salt marshes, that we're using living shorelines to help stabilize our shore, and it's going to provide habitat for lots of animals, including our diamondback terrapins. If we look broader than North Carolina, we have Head Start programs that are existing in Maryland, New Jersey, Florida, and some other states as well. In these programs, classes receive little baby diamondback terrapins. They raise them throughout the school year, and then at the end of the school year, they release them. And this has been shown when you have that hatchling diamondback terrapin, those 9 months inside the classroom has shown to get them to a size of about a 2 to 3 year old terrapin. So it's giving them a better chance when they're out in their environment. Down in Florida, they are doing road surveys during nesting season. So if they know there are areas where diamondback terrapins nest, they're walking along those roads looking for those terrapins. They help them cross the road if they can. If they come across a terrapin that is injured or one that has recently passed, they are incubating the eggs from those terrapins. So for the injured ones, they will have them induce egg laying, and then the terrapin will go to a terrapin rescue, and then they'll hatch those eggs and then release those eggs to the wild. And then down in Georgia, Skidway Audubon Terrapin Rescue Project, that's a really big name, but they are marking off the nests and protecting the nests from predators, and then helping those young when they hatch. So pretty good things all around. Now, what can you guys do to help our terrapins? Number one, marsh cleanups, roadside cleanups, keeping our environment nice and clean is a really important thing to do, not just for our terrapins, but for all of our animals. You can report abandoned or derelict crab pots to marine fisheries. It is against the law for you to remove a crab pot, but you can tell marine fisheries exactly where it is, and they do crab pot roundups every year, and they remove those derelict crab pots. So let them know where they are, they'll remove them. If you're out enjoying our beautiful waterways and you're back in the creeks and the marshes, use a slower speed. You don't tend to see a whole terrapin. All you'll see is their little head popping up above the water. So just go a little bit slower through those areas, especially during nesting season. Come volunteer with Terrapin Tally. I know this is from 2023. Their 2025 information will be out soon. So keep an eye out on that. It's done by the Wildlife Federation and the reserve system. So keep an eye out for those trainings. If you are using a recreational crab pot, add a bycatch reduction device. They're about $1 online, so they aren't too expensive. Or if you're getting a new pot, see if you can get one with that narrow funnel design. And then finally, if you see a terrapin crossing the road, you can help it cross the road. If it's safe for you to do so, please don't injure yourself. That's not my goal. But if it is safe for you, you can move that terrapin in the direction that it was going. Don't move it back to where it came from. Move it where it was going. Otherwise, it's just going to try to cross again. And with that, do you guys have any questions or comments? Has anyone seen a Diamondback Terrapin in the wild? A few friends? They're great. Keep an eye out. They're amazing. Oh yeah, definitely. It should, that QR code should work. It is not. It is no longer restricted to kayaks. So if you see them anywhere, you are welcome to. They're especially interested in nesting data right now. That's a great question. I'm not sure what every state has different, every state is managing their terrapins a little bit differently and has them listed differently. And so I think in North Carolina, because you have to have that special exemption to have them, it makes it a little bit trickier than in some of the other states. That's a good question though. Yeah. Are the bycatch devices mandatory? They are in those management areas from March until, I want to say, the end of summer. But just in those management areas right now. They're hoping to expand it with the commercial blue crab fishery, but they are just mandatory for commercial fishermen in those areas. They won't be what? They can be out in the sound. They can be out in the sound. It really depends on what time of year it is, because they will kind of bury in the underwater in the mud during the winter months. And so then you can accidentally catch them at that time. Any other questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, that's understandable. So they initially started out mainly interested in learning what they could about these animals and releasing the animals, just a subset of the animals, back to increase the population. As time moved forward, in the late 1920s or mid 1920s, that's when they got the idea of that hatchery restock program. And that's why they closed the fishery, because they wanted to help the fishery in the late 1920s. But overarchingly, the goal was, let's increase our number of terrapins in the wild. And it was private companies that were more focused on raising terrapins for market. So the lab itself transition to commercial? No, they did not transition to commercial. And one of the lab also do the same for the water and turtles and butterflies and green and they tried. They tried to do similar things with loggerhead sea turtles, but sea turtles are more finicky when it comes to nesting requirements, and they just weren't successful with it. So they ended up stopping those experiments. Different pens, different areas, but yes, the same lab, same area in Beaufort. I think it was in the 19 teens was when they were testing that. We have a friend in the back who had a question for a long time. Is it legal to commercially farm them? At this point, no. Just because they are listed as special concern animal, and so they are their populations are pretty heavily managed at the moment. So not in North Carolina. Yes. Right. I didn't come across much of that. I know that we see dredging impacting sea turtles, and it's quite possible that the dredging is impacting the terrapins. I just didn't come across that research, so I don't know for sure. And I don't want to misspeak on it. All right, yeah, last question. As the deterioration of salad or that in shells very detrimental for this. So the question is about the submerged aquatic vegetation and the loss of it in our areas. It is a really important habitat for them, and that decrease goes along with kind of the loss of salt marshes and having declining populations for them as well. Any habitat that these animals can live in, if we can help protect it and restore it, is going to be beneficial to them. Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you guys all so much for coming. Again, our next Maritime Heritage Lecture is on October 17th, and it's the story of Echo with Keith Ripmaster at 11 o'clock. So please stop by and enjoy the rest of your day. You're welcome.